Hey guys, my name is Naguura, and today I'm going to be talking about Lost Ark. First of all, I want to quickly say that I've only played the closed beta, so I've not played the game on like the Korean version or the Russian version before, so I've only had a couple of hours into the game from the beta. I did level only and I didn't play endgame content, so of course endgame content is like a huge deal in MMOs, and me not having experienced this, just take my opinion with a grain of salt because lots of things obviously I personally haven't experienced. But let's talk about the first like impression that I got from the game. First of all, this is an MMO and like an ARPG, kind of like a mixture of both. It's like an asymmetric kind of game where you move with your mouse, the camera is locked, and you're basically aiming your abilities. Very similar to something like Diablo, even League of Legends, like MOBAs usually have this kind of playstyle as well. I personally have never played an MMO that had this kind of style and this kind of movement. And I'm also not really into stuff like Diablo. So I personally was like, oh, maybe I don't like this as much. But then I started playing it and I felt like it was really refreshing and it was actually really cool. So I'm going to give that one a thumbs up and I actually like that. Then when it came to the style and the look of the game, I do think overall it looked great. I'm personally a fan of like this whole fantasy style, so I did like it. I felt everything looked pretty cool. The only like minus points that I want to give are the classes are gender locked. So if you want to play a certain class, you have to play the gender that they tell you to play, which is a bit weird for an MMO in my opinion because you're literally, like it's not that you just play a 50-minute game like League of Legends or something where gender lock kind of is relevant. No, you're actually playing a character for like a long, long time. So being forced to play a certain gender is kind of weird in my mind. And then there's also like a lack of customization when it comes to the characters too, on top of the problem with the gender lock as well. So yeah, a little bit of a minus point there, but overall the game does look good. Then let's move on to the story and the questing, at least like the early part. Because people told me the story of this game is really good, and I'm usually not a story player at all. So I was like, you know what? I don't want to miss out on the story if it's going to be that good and people are going to be flaming me again for not knowing things. So I'm just going to like pay attention. So I quested and I read like every quest text and I watched every cutscene. And it was boring for the first, at least for the first like 20 levels. The story was like not interesting, and it was like it basically just you had to figure out one thing for like the main story plot. But to figure out this one thing, you had to do like a billion other things that are completely irrelevant to the bigger story. And it felt really tedious and like a waste of my time to actually read all of this quest text. So I ended up not like I ended up stopping to read every single quest text and I only watched like cutscenes, and it did eventually get more interesting later on. So I'm like between level 30 40, I felt like it did get more interesting. So maybe that's what people were talking about. Maybe it's just like a really slow start. It's very possible. Games like Final Fantasy 14, they also have like a slow start and then it becomes more interesting. So maybe it's that. Again, I haven't played the whole leveling experience. I'm just speaking of, the level that I've reached. So yeah, at the start, boring. Later on, a bit more interesting. Then let's talk about gameplay. The gameplay is absolutely amazing. I cannot say a single negative thing about gameplay, to be honest. Everything just feels great. All of your abilities, they look cool. They feel like smooth and crisp, and it's like they look good, they sound good even, like the sound is like really satisfying, and it just feels really impactful. Like each ability that you press feels incredibly impactful, and it's just very responsive as well. So it's absolutely great. I've loved it so far. Then the dungeons and the events that I've been going to through my leveling experience felt pretty great as well. All of the dungeons and the events seemed really like, it didn't seem just another dungeon where, like everything seems the same. It's just different kinds of mobs, like everything felt very unique and everything felt just great. Like all of the abilities are great that the bosses are casting. Like you can react to the abilities and you can learn even in the leveling process in the like low level dungeons. It felt like you're learning things as you go, and things, you know, like you can die and do something wrong in early experiences already. And it felt great. And were like very unique events within the dungeons where, you know, like there's a cutscene and then all of a sudden you're walking up somewhere and then the bottom part like breaks away, and then like you have this short moment where you think your character's gonna fall off, but then you keep going. It felt very like single player like almost in some of these dungeons, and it felt really good. So I'm a big fan of the content that I've been doing so far when it comes to dungeons, events, and playstyle. Outside of that, the questing experience, outside of the story, you know, just like the way the quests work and what you have to do for the quests, it's pretty boring. Yeah, it's definitely not great. It felt like a lot of walking around back and forth. It felt like the same quests all the time. A lot of the mobs that you have to kill are, it's just kind of annoying, to be honest. Like it just feels boring. I wouldn't mind the questing itself being boring if the story is interesting, but even that, as I said at the start, is really slow. So maybe it gets better eventually. I don't know, because I haven't reached that point. The early experience kind of lackluster when it comes to questing and story. All right, so I just want to like wrap up my thoughts about the positive things real quick. I personally think this game can be incredibly promising when it comes to endgame, because the gameplay just feels so good, right? Gameplay feels amazing, and dungeons and the events that I've done so far feel really good. So those two things mean, in my mind, that the endgame PvE can be incredibly good, right? Endgame PvE, and a lot of people have also said that the PvP is great. I did try PvP in the beta, but it wasn't working properly. The numbers are bugged below level 50, which is what I tried. So I can't really speak of that too much. But I played like a 3 versus 3 arena, and it did feel interesting. So maybe, you know, that can be something that is good as well if the numbers are fixed and you're max level. So endgame PvE and PvP content, very, very like promising. And also the rating could be really good with the experience that I had in dungeons and other PvE events. But let's talk about the possible negative thoughts that I have. I do want to say before I go into this that I haven't reached endgame yet. So all of my thoughts are just theories, and I'm not sure if that's exactly how it's going to look like in the end. But let me speak of the monetization first of all. So the monetization model they have for this game is that it's free to play. But there's like an in-game shop where you basically can spend money to buy certain crystals. And you can use those crystals for various things in-game that actually speed up processes that are related to player power gains, right? Now, these blue crystals you can also buy with in-game currency. So you could compare this to something like similar to like WoW tokens. It's not really a WoW token, but it's like similar. And the impact that this has on the game is either kind of irrelevant or it's really bad. And that really depends on how much gold you're making later on. See, this is something I personally don't know yet. And I think a lot of people don't know yet because it kind of depends on what they're going to do with the end game. The thing is, if you're playing the game and you're making so much gold within like, let's say you're playing like an hour per day approximately. And let's say you're making so much gold within that hour per day that you would never need to spend real life money on these blue crystals, then the pay to win aspect kind of is irrelevant, right? Because at that point, why would you spend money on crystals when you make so much gold or in-game currency within that hour of game time? That makes no sense, right? Because you can just use your in-game currency or money, right? One of the two things. So if a player that plays a decent amount gets enough money, enough in-game currency to pay for all of this that you need the crystals for, then the monetization model kind of is irrelevant for people that actually play the game. And yeah, people who play less than an hour per day, or they play, you know, like even, you know, like once a week or whatever, if they don't have enough gold to pay for that, the crystals, and then they use the money for it, I would say whatever, because those people who only play an hour a day, if they feel like you know, like if they want to spend the money on it, then fine in my mind, right? Like I don't care if you want to spend your money on that, if you're only playing 1 hour a week, whatever, right? But as long as the people who play the game like a decent amount don't ever feel tempted to pay, then I'm fine with the model in my mind. Now, they could also tune a different law. It really depends on how they are balancing this and tuning this. Because if you play a decent amount per week and you don't make enough in-game currency to be able to afford all of the crystals that you theoretically need to do the content, and you feel like you have a disadvantage versus compared to other people who are spending the crystals, even though you are playing a decent amount, then it's the situation where this model is bad, right? Again, I don't know what it's gonna look like at the end, and I don't know how they're gonna balance this. And another thing I do want to say is that they have an impact on this, right? They can change how much in-game currency you're making, and they can change the prices, the blue crystal prices of all of these things as well. So they have a direct impact of how much time you have to spend to make the in-game currency to afford these kind of things that you can buy with crystals, right? So they can tell you guys, hey, you need to play the game 2 hours a week to be able to afford everything with in-game currency. Or they can say, hey, you need to play the game 20 hours a week to afford everything with in-game currency. And that's a big difference, right? 2 hours a week, then in my mind, this is completely irrelevant, right? In my mind, a person that plays 2 hours a week, if they can afford everything, they never feel tempted, I'm fine. But if I am forced, or if I don't want to say forced, but if I feel like I have to play a certain amount, or otherwise I'm going to have a disadvantage in comparison to a person that would just spend money, then I feel bad about the system, right? And that's it. That's the whole opinion that I have about this. One more negative thing that I wanted to mention that is directly correlated to the monetization system is this whole stronghold island kind of mini game island that I've found. So basically each person has like their island, and it almost felt like its own phone game, very similar to something like Raid Shadow Legends when it came to the actual like buildings. Like you have these buildings, and then you can research things within the buildings, and then you can speed up the process by paying blue crystals, which really felt phone gamey. But again, this kind of system, like this island thing, if you make enough in-game currency to easily afford those crystals, it doesn't necessarily matter. If you don't make enough gold to afford these crystals, then it does matter, because then it feels bad if you can't speed up the process without, paying for crystals or whatever. So again, it all depends on how they're balancing this whole crystal thing, how much gold you're actually going to be making in-game without spending like hours and hours and hours to make up the difference between a person that pays. That's my opinion. This is not good or bad at the moment. It totally depends on what they're doing with it. I still would prefer a different system. I would rather pay for the game and then not have these kind of concerns in my mind where I'm like at the mercy of them balancing the system, because you could play the game and the blue crystal system is like irrelevant to you because you make enough gold. And then all of a sudden they're like changing something in the game, and all of a sudden you feel like, oh, well, now I'm not making enough gold anymore because they changed this, and now I need to play more to make up for it. And it's a bad feeling to have. So I personally would prefer if it's just like a paid game model where you're paying for it. Maybe, like have an in-game shop where it's only cosmetics, pay for the initial game or whatever, whatever they're doing. I would prefer that over these kind of pay-to-win options that could theoretically become bad in the future. But this is how the game is, and I personally am still hopeful, and I do think that it can be a really good game. It just really depends on how they're handling this whole crystal situation, and I do hope the end game is gonna be as good as I think it will be, and then I will totally check it out. And yeah, that's it. this is my review. Let me know what you guys think about this game in the comments below. Did you play the beta? If not, did you watch some streams? What's your opinion on the game? Do you agree that the playstyle and everything does feel great? And the whole, monetization model. I know a lot of people have very, very negative thoughts about the monetization model, but just keep in mind that what I said earlier, that maybe it really does not have a bad impact on the game at all. Really depends on how they're balancing it in the end. But yeah, let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!